It's been so long since we spoke to each other. I've been asked to give you an overview of EOS governance. Governance, as I think most folks in the room know, is one of the big claims to fame to differentiate the EOS blockchain from other blockchains. This is my own brief and very subjective overview. Your mileage may vary. This is my best thinking so far, until one of you challenges me and I realize how wrong I was, and then I'll change the slides. What is governance? I believe that the word governance is best used to describe three things. A system of, number one, making collective decisions. Where shall we all go to lunch? What shall we do with inflation? Should we implement SegWit? Whatever the collective is and how that collective makes a decision. And then number two, carries the decision out. And then number three, how does the group tweak the decision-making rules for next time? So for example, that might be, let's change EOS inflation from some number to some other number. Then we have to actually carry out the decision, because having chosen is not the same thing as having done. And then, shall we amend the rules for voting on inflation? Right? Simple, it would seem. Much of what I'm going to tell you is framed in the context of what I learned reading this book, Governing the Commons. Now, Governing the Commons was written by Elinor Ostrom. She shared the 2009 Nobel Prize in Economics for her lifetime work studying how human societies actually manage their common pool resources. Now, common pool resource is anything that we share where if I take a little more, there's less for you. And if you take a little more, there's less for me. And if we both take too much, the whole thing gets hurt. Like a fishery, or the meadow that we share, or the commons, the green in our town, or RAM and bandwidth on our blockchain, things we share, yes? And so what Ostrom did was study real-world human institutions that had gone between 100 and 1,000 years of successfully managing their common pool resources, something that theoreticians will tell us is impossible. The tragedy of the commons, the prisoner's dilemma, it can't be done. We must have a single overpowering authority telling us to cooperate. Not true, not true. And in her studies, she found, she didn't invent, she found by looking 8 principles that the successful communities had created over time to self-manage. And the first 4 are these. Number one, to define clear group boundaries so we know who's in and who's out. You're allowed to take fish from the fishery, but that other person, they're not allowed. They're not part of our group. Without those boundaries, anybody can come in and take. Number 2, match the rules to the local conditions. My part of the blockchain might be different from your part. My enclave might be different from yours. This part of the irrigation system may be different from that part of the irrigation system. And so each part might need to have its own rules for its own unique truths. Number 3, to ensure that the people affected by the rules can participate in modifying the rules, because of course that's where the knowledge is. That's the learning loop. If you can't change the rules affecting you, how can your suffering and your learning cause improvement to occur? It can't. Number 4, ensure that the rulemaking rights of this community are respected by outsiders. That this village is not overridden and harmed by the state is not harmed and overridden by the federal, and so forth. 5 through 8. Number 5, community members can monitor each other's behavior. Because if I can sneak fish out of the fishery, I'll get away with it. But if I can be seen and caught, well, I'm more likely to cooperate. Number 6 is graduated sanctions. Ostrom found that it can be very small sanctions are more than enough to control people's behavior and drive folks to cooperate. But the absence of sanctions and observation, cooperation fell apart. Number 7, a low-cost means of dispute resolution. And number 8, to build in nested tiers. One example that she gave that really stuck with me was the irrigation system, that the farmers who shared a single sluice gate all had to have meetings together to talk about their gate. And they would each send a delegate from their gate to the group that managed the feeder line that had a bunch of gates on it, because they all had a shared interest in that feeder line. And then they would send a couple of delegates up to the larger group that handled the larger aspect of the irrigation system. And that this ability to nest was tremendously important in keeping the whole healthy. So here's how we're trying to honor Ostrom's wisdom in the design of our governance. Our boundaries are token holders who have signed the Constitution. We have the ability to match rules to local conditions. All throughout the blockchain, we are built in to be able to honor that through Ricardian contracts, through dApps, and so forth. Number 3, referenda and discussion groups. Again, the referendum software isn't launched yet, but it's coming, and it's tremendously important, as you can tell. Number 4 is the one I think most of us don't really understand yet, and it is perhaps the thing I would like you to pay the most attention to in this talk. If we are to be our own entity, if we are to remain independent of local courts, we must take advantage of UNCTRAL and the New York Convention of 1958, which led to over 150 nations passing each their own version of something called the Arbitration Act. And the Arbitration Act says that if you and Fred are in a dispute and the two of you agreed in your contract that you would abide by arbitration, and then you go through arbitration and you're not happy, and you come to the local court and say, I didn't like my arbitration, I want you, the local court, to get involved in the dispute. That local court will say, no, no, no. Our nation signed the 1958 New York Convention. We have an Arbitration Act, and it says that if you agreed to arbitration, and if arbitration happened according to the rule set outlined in UNCTRAL, then it is binding on you, and I, the local court, will not overrule that. This is the only way I'm aware of for EOS to be able to break free of the long arm of sovereign states and to be our own nation. Without this, I don't think it's possible. Number 5. Can we monitor each other's behavior? We seem to be very good at that and getting better. Blockchains are public. There have been some tremendous tools created to look at who's voting for whom, who's paying whom, if somebody stole something, where did it go? Graduated sanctions we're still working on, because that does require arbitration to work, and we don't yet have, as a community, a clear understanding of what kinds of sanctions are big enough or small enough or appropriate for different kinds of transgressions. A year from now, we will have standardized, but today it's still very early. Number 7, arbitration. There's an open market for arbitration. Most people know about ECAF as the default arbitration. What they don't realize is that every single Ricardian contract that you write or sign can name any arbitration forum you like, or any individual arbitrator. You are in control of that. And if you would like to launch your very own arbitration forum, I say, awesome, please do. That would be great. And then number 8, nested tiers. We have the ability to support that. We always have. It's built into the structure of the system. I know, there's a test later. It's a lot of information here. Now, we are coming into the world stage 35 days after mainnet launch in the context of other permissionless blockchains that have been in the public eye for up to 10 years. And most people are viewing this through the lens of the public permissionless blockchain world. And what is the promise of that? What are people used to? Well, there's several things. You know, censorship resistance is one and so forth, but decentralization is perhaps the one that's the biggest for me in terms of the ability to create new economic realities. And of course, decentralization does empower individuals. Of course, it does ease entry of new competitors, and it does better serve customers. But we haven't seen the kind of widespread adoption of blockchain I think a lot of us would have loved. Why? Because of the problem with public blockchain, which is also decentralization. Namely, there's nobody in charge. There's nobody in charge. Crooks can go wild, and they have, Code is the law. And in less than a decade, well, hackers have made off with, well, I think we're up to, what is it, $71 million a month as of about a month ago. We've got the infographics being created, cute infographics showing, look how pretty theft is. And, you know, $500 million of NIM gone. And it's awful. And that's why people aren't building systems on top of that. This is perhaps my favorite example of the problem with permissionless blockchains, because when you can lose $300 million accidentally, wait, you lost $300 million accidentally. Try to explain that to your boss or your customers. Yeah, that $300 million you entrusted me with. Yeah, we lost it. And then read the subheadline. User mistakenly takes control of hundreds of wallets containing cryptocurrency Ether, destroying it in a panic while trying to give them back. You can't make this up. This isn't working. You can't build systems for daily living on top of that kind of a foundation where one bug wipes out hundreds of millions of dollars, someone's life savings. That's why the big players today in public permissionless blockchains are speculators, miners, and crooks. Speculators who play the zero-sum game. If I buy low and sell high, it's because some other idiot bought high. Or miners, they do create security, but what value do they create? Economic value. And of course, the crooks. And that's why a public permissioned blockchain alternative was thought of and has been launched, and it's called EOS. It's called the governed blockchain. And to understand a governed blockchain, you have to understand the New Chicago School model by Lawrence Lessig. And you're thinking, oh, of course, the New Chicago School model by Lawrence Lessig. I was reading that last night, you say, right? There's 4 forces operating. You can think of it this way. Market forces, legal, social, and code. And here's what Bitcoin looks like through that lens. There's only 2 forces. There's the code on the left, creating market forces coming from above to constrain people's behavior. But there's only a tiny bit of law enforcement way off out the edge, and there's no coherent social force. Here's Ethereum, again, same framework, code, market incentives, a little bit of law enforcement from off the edge, and a little bit of off-chain sort of kind of social forces. If you want to be heartbroken, look up the EIPs 867 and 999. Those are 2 different efforts to claw back the $300 million lost in the parity wallet bug, the one I mentioned. And they still haven't gone anywhere. And it's been over a year and a half. I'm not sure how long it's been. I'm sure it's much too long if it was your 300 million or even any of it was yours. How heartbreaking must that be to see it sitting there on the Ethereum blockchain taunting you, but you can't get to it because the code is the law. What if you decided to build a system where all 4 forces were co-equal, where all 4 forces were given their proper place to create a balanced whole? That might look something like this. Starting with markets, everyone has skin in the game. You got risk of sanctions, you have to stake. Legal systems have been built. There's a constitution. There's Ricardian contracts, which are legally binding. There's arbitration. Socially, we're engaging in repeated interactions. We're building on identity or pseudo-identity, reputation. We engage in discussions with each other to decide what's right, which way do we want to go as a group. And then the code. Block producers can, I say can, they need to be able to, and soon they'll be able to, when the sudo is rolled out, replace code, freeze accounts, and move funds in order to carry out arbitrators' instructions. But the key here is that the legislature has to do its job. The legislature are these token holders who elect the block producers and set policy. And the executive branch are the block producers. They have superpowers, but they can only use those superpowers when told to do so either by the legislature or by the judicial system. And then there's a judicial branch that can only rule on specific cases that are brought to them by plaintiffs who have given the arbitrator standing. And of course, they're all three are underlined by Constitution and contract law. We can dive in even deeper and look at the legislature. How's that holding up? We have to have a functioning referendum system for the legislative function to work properly. It's not there yet. It must be. And we have to have some form of ballot access to control what kinds of things are gone. We can't have a spam attack of 10,000 referenda for the voters to paw through. They won't do it. We have to have voters who will fire bad block producers, and so far they have not always. And this will break down if block producers collude with corrupt whales. So there's a risk. From the executive perspective, block producers have massive power but no discretion, except in emergencies and only emergencies, and then they're expected to call in an arbitrator. They can only carry out the results of referenda and arbitrators' orders otherwise. And they have to follow the rules of reg producer. Now, by the way, many of us are upset with some of the block producers that are currently receiving either block awards or vote rewards or both, who have not abided by the text of the reg producer command. They haven't put up a website. They haven't published their disclosures. They're not in compliance with reg producer. But to the best of my knowledge, nobody has actually asked an arbitrator for a ruling on that. So you can't say that arbitration is broken or governance is broken if nobody bothers to file the dispute. Remember, arbitrators aren't walking around looking for things to rule on. You have to bring a case to them. So if you are a block producer and you have been harmed by somebody else pulling money out of the leaky bucket in violation of reg producer, which is a wrongful taking, you've had money taken from you, and you have standing to demand that that be put right. But people are going to have to step up. They're going to have to require that these rules be enforced by taking a stand. And on the judicial side, the arbitrators only rule on specific cases, and the members decide who their arbitrator is. They pick the arbitration forum in advance in their Ricardian contract. If they are assigned a particular arbitrator they feel is not neutral, they can challenge that and have that person replaced by a different arbitrator. And the arbitrator must follow the Constitution and the rules of dispute resolution. If they don't, their ruling is null and void. So this is a tightly balanced and thought out system. I want to drill in a little bit into arbitration and ECAF because it's one of the areas that I think needs the most attention from all of us. You know that arbitrators rule on specific cases, and that ECAF, the EOS Core Arbitration Forum, is the named arbitration forum in the version 1 Constitution, which remains in force until a referendum replaces it. I mentioned earlier, ECAF uses UNCITRAL-based rules of dispute resolution, which are valid in 150 countries around the world. And the disputants are always free to leave ECAF at any time if the disputants agree to disagree somewhere else. The life cycle of a dispute, some of you have seen this drawing before. Here are some of the internal processes ECAF uses to handle incoming cases. Here's my conclusion. Governance is growing up, but it is still not grown up. We need more arbitrators in ECAF. Please do not nominate yourself as an arbitrator. There are two kinds of people who think they'd make great arbitrators, and one of them is wrong. If other people think you'd be a great arbitrator, then you might be. If you're the only person that thinks you'd make a great arbitrator, I promise you, you will not be. So if you can think of somebody that you think, wow, I would not mind being judged by that person, nominate them. We need the enforcement powers of sudo. We need the referendum contract. We need to demand honest block producers, and the voters must hold block producers accountable. And we need key recovery to be implemented by Block 1. One last thing I'll mention. I said earlier that if a block producer takes money from the block producer reward fund while being in violation of the letter of the Ricardian contracts that they've signed. They signed two of them. They signed Reg Producer when they say, please vote for me, and they sign Claim Reward every time they get money. And both of those contain Ricardian contracts that they are agreeing to follow. But we see people who are in office who certain wallets are voting for and putting them into at least vote reward, and in some cases block reward, as far as I can tell, for no good reason, because they're not good block producers. They haven't published their disclosures. They can't be reached. They don't talk to anybody. So what can we do? And this sudo capability is really scary, because if people can prop up sock puppet block producers, what's to stop them from propping up 15 sock puppet block producers, grabbing hold of the ECAF power and overruling everything on the chain? It's tremendously frightening, or at least it should be. So I have a proposal for you. And that would be this. It's not mine to say, but I offer it to you. What if we as a chain said, the moment the 7th sock puppet is voted in as a block producer, because 7's a magic number, it blocks the use of sudo by honest users. Whatever the block height is, when that 7th one is voted in, we will back the chain up one block, we will fork, and every wallet that voted for a sock puppet is dropped to a balance of 0. That would hold those toxic wallets to account, and it would hold off the threat of sock puppets taking over the chain, maybe. We're going to have to come up with good countermeasures. We're going to have to rehearse that. We're going to have to think it through and game it out on test nets. But I'm not aware of any other approach that can keep us safe, that we can use sudo safely in the presence of people who are voting for block producers that can't be trusted. So we've got big challenges ahead. And I think we're up for it, but we're going to need your help. Thank you all very much.